Hello and welcome to the NVR podcast number 12. I'm Rachael Aylmer.
And I'm Peter Jakob.
And today we're talking about being the boundary. Peter, can you just begin with telling me perhaps how you came up with this theme, this particular topic, and why you want to talk about it in the podcast?
Well, I was discussing presence with my friend and colleague Dan Dahlberger the other day. And Dan put forward the idea that parental presence is very much connected with a boundary, and that there is a boundary between parents and children, follows on from some of the ideas that were developed a long time ago by the early family therapist Salvador Minuchin, who spoke of a functioning executive subsystem. So Minuchin said that when the parents are really in a productive and constructive alliance with one another, and in that sense separate from the child, then things in the family tend to go better. I said to Dan that I felt that there is another aspect of presence that's very important, which is connection. That the parents, in particularly, from the vantage point of child-focused work in NVR, that the parents have greater presence when they are able to reach out and connect to the child. We sort of hit on the idea that the concept of boundary does not have to be separating, That boundary can mean certain kinds of separation, which enable certain kinds of connection. And Dan came up with this idea of the boundary as connective tissue, in the body. So connective tissue is a boundary. On the one hand, it separates, and on the other hand, it brings together.
Okay.
So that's a both and. And I felt that was a really interesting metaphor, a really interesting idea to explore.
Okay.
I was just wondering, from your experience in, as an NVR practitioner and as a supervisor, I just wonder what are your sort of associations with the idea of a boundary in families that in the NVR process?
But I think the boundary sometimes I think could represent in my mind the goalposts, the limits, the connection, how parents position themselves, how they kind of interact with their child. The boundary being both a physical sense as well. When I think about the boundary and I think about tailing and I think about parental presence and how a parent shows up at a place, setting a boundary. I recall a parent who turned up at the 24-hour McDonald's, a ridiculous hour, to show her presence and her continued care for her daughter. She did that more than once, setting those boundaries that she wasn't going to sit at home waiting for her child to return, excuse me, but she was going to reiterate her message of love and care for her child by returning and setting those boundaries. I don't know whether I'm on the right path of what you were talking about.
I think that's a beautiful example for this idea of the boundary as connective tissue. Just to throw in, you've used the word tailing. Perhaps not all of our listeners are familiar with that concept in NVR. Tailing is when a parent makes themselves felt, or when parents make themselves felt in perhaps dangerous places that their children go to, when they don't come home on time, when they run away from home. Sometimes, when we're talking about young people engaging in county lines or gang activity, these are dangerous places which parents often avoid and support them in making themselves felt in those places. And that's the overall concept of tailing. I like your example because Dan spoke about some words that Chaim Omer used. Chaim spoke of the parents setting themselves as the boundary.
Mm.
And it made me think of how often parents say to us, well, I tried to set a boundary and it didn't work.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that is as if you were putting the boundary outside of yourself. It's the attempt to control the child, to control the young person, and to say, you have to do this from now on, you have to stop doing that, or else such and such a thing will happen, and they fail. Because
and the success of that, putting that in place, isn't necessarily how the child responds to it. The success is your attempts, your position, your voice.
What you are like.
Yeah.
And, Chaim's words of setting oneself as the boundary, I translate that, I hope it's not an oversimplification, as being boundary.
Yeah.
In myself as a parent. And I'm just thinking of this mother who showed up at the 24-hour McDonald's being the boundary. Yeah. Rather than, and if you don't come home on time, this or that will happen, you'll have your phone taken away or whatever. It's, here I am. I love and care about you. I am using myself, and I will not accept that you're not home, but I am setting myself, in Chaim's words, I am being that boundary. And that strikes me as a very, very different idea of boundary.
Mm.
And in that, your example, I think, also shows us how that boundary is connective, because rather than responding in a way that is punitive, that where the parent tries to be a deterrent by imposing certain consequences and so forth, which don't work anyway, otherwise they wouldn't come to see us. The parent is reaching out in her opposition to what her daughter is doing. She's reaching out to the daughter. She's going there. She's showing herself, she is being a boundary in an embodied sense, like you said, you spoke, the body being there, and that strikes me as key.
Incredibly powerful. And I recall the parent working with her and preparing her for this impromptu visit to the 24-hour McDonald's and checking in what she needed. She was an incredibly resourceful parent and very, very strong. She didn't need any other support, she said. She was prepared to do that alone. So the child really did get a sense of her mother, just her mother, turning up, and her mother's calmness and peacefulness, but also her mother's strength in persisting with that message. Was that she was fearful of her daughter's late night activities, and the message was that she wasn't prepared to accept this behaviour. And it was that persistence. But I recall having a session immediately after and how the mother felt when she turned up at the McDonald's in front of the face of all the other teenagers there that were congregated, and her strength when she left without her daughter, and her strength when she went back the same evening. in the early hours, and then the strength she felt when her daughter agreed to go with her, and they went home.
So her strength and her sense of strength
Yeah.
did not depend on whether her daughter complied with her expectations or not.
No.
What did she derive that sense of strength from?
Well, I think her absolute ability to want to keep her daughter safe, how she wanted to communicate with her daughter about her choices in life, and that sense of she was never going to give up on her, whatever the child was doing.
So the mother took strength from her own determination.
Yeah, definitely.
That's a fair thing to say.
Amazing.
And I would imagine eventually the daughter would have a sense of that. I'm thinking of someone I'm working with right now, and a mother who complained that to me that when she sits in the car, her son gets verbally aggressive and shouts, And I felt that's dangerous because she might get distracted driving. She could hit someone or another car. So it's actually very dangerous to have someone in the car who is having a meltdown, as she put it. But at the same time, it is like being a captive in the car. I mean, I come across this very often, that young people will perhaps be more aggressive in the car because the parent feels they are trapped, cannot escape. And what she then did after we discussed her response was she pulled over when he shouted, and she asked him to take the bus home. And she said that if he doesn't take the bus home, then she will leave the car there and she will take the bus home. And she said to me, he looked shocked. And he said, please, Mom, let's just drive home. I'll control myself. And she said, okay, we'll try it. And he did. And he's stopped shouting since. So I asked her about what that situation felt like to her, particularly, when she said he looked shocked. How did that feel that he looked shocked to her? And she said, well, it felt actually good. And because I was very interested in this, because this particular mother had been very worried in the past about antagonizing her son in any shape or form. And I said, so I asked her how come it felt good? Well, what felt good about it? And she said, it seemed to me he realized how serious I am about it. And this seriousness, that the mother was prepared to take the consequence herself of getting on the bus if her son doesn't get on the bus, and that she is absolutely no longer accepting of his shouting in the car. That struck me as being the boundary and embodying that. And it also strikes me as a prerequisite for actual connection. Because to sort of segue into another way of looking at this, a parent in such a situation takes on an enormous load of feeling humiliated at times, anxious at times, feeling disappointed, worrying about the sort of the moral rectitude of their child, and what kind of an adult their child will grow into, and so on. And these feelings sit with them. And I've seen many parents who've felt that they must harmonize when the child harmonizes, who feel that a kid who has just kicked them and spat at them, and a while later says, hey, let's go to the park, that they need to go to the park and act as if they were happy with the child. Particularly when there's a history of trauma, I've often called this the crossover effect. And there's a problem with that, which is that there is no real mutuality. There is no real reciprocity between parent and child at this point. Parent is acting as if they're okay with the child, and the child is acting as if the parent was okay with them. And there is a lack of authenticity. And I believe that being the boundary in such a situation can mean, you know what, I'm sure we'll be able to go to the park again soon. But at this point, I'm not ready to. I'm still too upset. And I would just be pretending that everything is okay if I went to the park with you right now. And I think that gives the parent the opportunity to regulate her own emotions and process them, to allow those emotions to take their course, And most feelings, when you allow them to take their course, they abate. The feelings, they get strong, a lot of thoughts come in with that, you're very preoccupied with that feeling, and then if you just allow that feeling to take its course inside of you, rather than trying to suppress it, it will take its course and it will abate. Again, it will diminish, it will get less, and then you're ready to re-engage with your child. When you're ready to re-engage with your child, then you are authentic, you're genuine. There's a real mutuality between parent and child. And that's, again, where I think that this metaphor that Dan used of the boundary as connective tissue, particularly salient.
I also think that it's helpful for the parent to still go to the park when they don't feel connected, so they have a real sense of what that feels like. If I imagine a dad harmonizing with his child in a time when he's not ready, and then goes to the park, but he still recognizes he's not ready, and his connection isn't as it perhaps could be, and he doesn't feel authentic. And I encourage that. I encourage a little bit of winging it, for the reason so that they can tap into those feelings of being disconnected, or those feelings of not being present, those feelings of not being the boundary, so that the next time, because there will be a next time, that then they know that they could leave a bit more space before they begin to harmonize, and they could leave a bit more space that then informs the child, I'm not ready to go to the park yet. But I think sometimes we need to almost play with those feelings. I imagine some families I'm working with where they have spent a very long time, many months, of harmonizing and connecting with the child when they're not ready. And I think having these discussions in sessions about finding the right time for themselves, allowing their voice to come through as a boundary, and to play with that. Does that even make sense? It's almost like it's important to still do it and be mindful about what you're trying to achieve, not harmonizing too soon, being the boundary, holding your position, and informing the child peacefully that you're not ready. That's, I think, can be a really new concept to many parents who have harmonized too soon.
So I'm trying to understand what you said. Let me see if I understand it. If I understand it correctly, you worked with a dad whom you encouraged to go along with his child, even when he wasn't ready, but to get in touch with those feelings of not having been ready yet, so that perhaps the next time he himself can be more in touch with those feelings and base his decision on what he's going to do at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you feel about this idea that it's really important for the parent to acknowledge that they are not ready to harmonize in order to be able to really engage with the child once they have regulated and perhaps processed those difficult feelings? Does that seem to make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you put it beautifully. That's exactly what I would think. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So the difference is what you're suggesting is to sometimes have some room for an experiment, to sort of do what you'd normally do, but to perhaps be more mindful as you're doing it of what's going on inside of you. So perhaps, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and something else in that experiment could shift. It could be that because you're in a different environment, because you went to the park, although you're not completely 100% ready to harmonize or to reconnect with the child, but actually having a change of environment has supported it and held it. Whereas if you stayed at home, you may have stayed in a position, a different mindset for longer. You may have struggled for a longer period. So there's something about shifting your position in a new environment which could prove to be helpful. And I think just constantly keeping in check with how you're feeling towards yourself, towards the child. What does your interactions look and feel like? And no 2 days are always the same, but I think it's a really wonderful stepping block, a building block to just help parents become aware of themselves in those moments when there's been rupture or a fracture in the relationship, or there's been violence and harm. And just building on that.
Well, I think you've just introduced a really, really important idea in that it seems that being the boundary may very well start with becoming aware of your own feelings and being mindful, becoming more mindful in that regard.
I think, yeah, because for me, with some of the families I've worked with, being the boundary, I think, could be interpreted as being punitive, setting these very rigid structures, being the boundary. And I think there could be a lovely, wonderful, gradual introduction to what a boundary can feel like for you, and when we can have sessions and talk about when you didn't feel it, and those differences, the richness, that connection. A mum recently said to me in a session that she just had a beautiful connection with her child by setting a boundary around his violence towards his younger brother, and she positioned herself right down on his level, and she opened her body language and tilted her head and looked in his eyes and just said, we don't hit, it's not okay. And that connection she felt.
Can I be a stickler for language?
Oh God, that's not like you.
Because I really would want to distinguish between being a boundary and setting a boundary.
Yeah.
And you just said people could understand being a boundary as being rigid and punitive.
Yeah.
And then you said this woman set a boundary by doing that and communicating with her body language. Now, to me, being a boundary in that sense, or as Heimer Mayer puts it, setting oneself as the boundary, is diametrically opposed to that rigidity and to being punitive, which I would call setting a boundary for the child, that rigidity. I'm setting a boundary for the child. I'm telling the child, you mustn't do this or else, X, Y, Z will happen to you. But this mother that you described, she got down and her whole body said many different things at the same time. It
Communicate everything.
We don't do this here in this family. It's not okay. At the same time, her body because she went down and spoke to him on an eye level, will have also communicated her love to her child at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a multi-layered communication where she is the boundary with all her feelings, the whole variance of herself.
Mm-hmm.
So I would not call that setting a boundary for the child. I would call that being the boundary. That to me is what being the boundary means.
Yeah.
And it ties in with an idea I've been playing with and working with a lot in recent months. I've been thinking of bringing mentalization into the work more. And I think when a parent has that kind of awareness of their own responses, of their own emotional responses to the child, and when they operate in the fullness of their own experience, they are also more able to be compassionate with the child, even while they're resisting. And I think they can then articulate things in a way that is helpful, so they can say, I'm aware that there's lots going on for you, and that it's really hard at school, and that group of kids have been calling you names and giving you a hard time. And we will do our best to see what we can do and help, work with the school to change that. But the aggression has to stop. So, that they can be that boundary while also showing compassion. I think being the boundary rather than trying to control the child and setting the boundary can enable that compassion, so that at the same time the child feels, oh, here is a boundary in my parent, and my parent is reaching out to me and addressing what I need. I feel understood, even if I haven't even put it in such words before.
Yeah. No, I think I think just as we come into a close with this topic, just some of the themes that have struck me in our conversation this morning. Being the boundary, I think, ultimately, for some people, for some families, for some systems and the way people function, could take some time to develop, to understand and to practice with. And I think it's that ability to work with their practitioner and have that space to practice and to feel where it sits with me on a really personal level. And I get very excited when parents feed back to me that they felt and sensed themselves connecting in a really different new way with their child, and it's those little nuggets that I like to keep drawing upon and going back to and expanding, and that's the building block, that's the first step. And when I hear that feedback, being the boundary, having that connection, it just really ignites me for parents who recognize that they have got that ability to do that, they've got the strength, they can make those connections. And I think, and even harder when they're also trying to resist harmful behaviours. Yeah, not easy task, but doable.
Okay, I've enjoyed our reflections together. Just wondering, what should we take home from the conversation? What could the listeners take home? Perhaps that the parent is at the center of our conversation as NVR practitioners, and that if we help the parent to be the boundary, we don't have to focus so much on what works with the child or not, because what works is a change in the relationship and a different perception of the parent by the child, and eventually more connection.
Yeah. Well, they are the centre of it. Yeah. Oh, that's lovely.
Okay.
Okay. As before, if anyone does have any burning questions or topics they'd like us to talk about, please email us at info@partnershipprojectsuk.com. And we apologise for this podcast being a little bit late, but time restrictions have prevented us from making a recording. So I hope you enjoy it.
It's the holiday season, isn't it?
Anyway, take care. Bye-bye.
Have a good holiday season. Bye.
Bye-bye.